You know, it's one thing to talk about our faith on a Sunday, but how do we actually live it out in the messy, everyday realities of life, especially in our own homes? Well, in this study, we're diving deep into a powerful chapter, 1 Peter 3. Here, the Apostle Peter gives us some incredibly practical counsel for navigating our relationships and our witness in the world. And we're going to discover how all of it, every single bit, is anchored in the unshakable hope we have in Jesus Christ.
All right, before we jump right into the text, it's really important to get our bearings. Where are we in God's grand timeline? You see, Peter is writing to the church. That's you, that's me. And he's writing during what we call the dispensation of grace, or the church age. This is the period we're in right now, after Christ's death and resurrection. It's so vital to remember this is not God's program for national Israel under the Old Testament law. This is his unique plan for believers from every nation who are called to live as pilgrims and strangers in this world. Understanding that context is the key to applying these truths correctly to our lives today.
So, here's our roadmap for this study. First, we're going to get a feel for the world Peter's original readers lived in. Then, we'll dive right into the text itself, looking at it verse by verse. After that, we'll zoom out a bit to see the core theological doctrines at play, and we'll wrap everything up by thinking about how we can apply these timeless truths to our lives right now. Let us begin with the historical and cultural background. Right. So, to really feel the impact of Peter's words, we need to try and step back in time. We need to get a sense of the world his audience was navigating, because once we do that, we'll see just how radical, how revolutionary his instructions really were.
I want you to imagine for a moment that you're a woman in the 1st century Roman Empire. In that culture, your husband is the head of the home, period. He expects you to follow his lead in everything, and that especially includes religion. But then, you hear the gospel of Jesus Christ, and your life is completely transformed. You believe, but your husband doesn't. Now what? This was a very real situation for so many women Peter was writing to, and his advice is just stunning. He doesn't tell them to argue or debate their husbands into the faith. Instead, he says to win them over with their godly character. He tells them to focus on the inner beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, declaring that this is more precious to God than all the gold or fancy hairstyles in the world. I mean, this completely flips the world's value system on its head.
Okay, so what about the husbands? In that culture, they held all the cards, all the legal power, the financial control, the social standing. But just listen to what Peter says to them. He commands them to use that power not to dominate, but to understand, to protect, and to honor their wives. He calls them to treat their wives as equals, as co-heirs of the gracious gift of life. And then he gives this stark warning. If you fail to do this, it will literally hinder your prayers. How a man treats his wife is a direct indicator of his relationship with God. That is a truth that is just as powerful today as it was 2,000 years ago.
With that historical context firmly in mind, let's move to the biblical narrative unpacked. All right, now we're ready to turn to the text of 1 Peter chapter 3 itself and see what the Spirit has to say to us today.
So Peter starts right there, in the home, addressing this very delicate reality of a spiritually divided marriage. And one of the first things you'll probably notice is the parallel structure. Wives in the same way, and husbands in the same way. Both are being called to a lifestyle that reflects their ultimate submission to Christ. For the wife, the goal is redemptive. Her hope is to win over her husband not with a sermon, but with the quiet sermon of a godly life. And for the husband, the call is to honor his wife, to recognize her as a full spiritual partner in the kingdom of God.
So, what does this look like in practice, day to day? Well, for the wife, it means her most powerful witness is her character. Her true beauty isn't external, it's her spirit. And her role model is Sarah from the Old Testament, who placed her hope firmly in God and refused to give way to fear. And for the husband, it means he must intentionally seek to know and understand his wife, her needs, her strengths, her vulnerabilities. He's to treat her not as property, but as an honored partner. And these aren't just suggestions. Peter says a husband's very prayer life, his connection to God, hinges on this. But Peter doesn't just stop with marriage. He then widens the lens, zooming out from the individual home to the entire church family. And his message here is just as radical. In a world that runs on revenge, a world that always keeps score, Peter calls believers to a completely different way of living. It's a life defined by blessing, not by retaliation. So what does this culture of blessing look like? Peter gives us 5 key ingredients: unity, sympathy, brotherly love, compassion, and humility. But the real test, of course, is how we respond when we're treated badly. Do we lash out? Do we trade insult for insult? Or do we make the active choice to bless them instead? Peter says we do this because we ourselves have been called to inherit a blessing from God,
And then he quotes Psalm 34 to assure us that God sees, he knows, and he will ultimately bring justice.
You see, that countercultural lifestyle inevitably leads us to one of the most famous verses in this entire letter. Peter knows that if we live this way, people are going to notice. They're going to look at our lives and ask, why are you so different? What is the source of this hope you have? And he tells us we must be prepared to give an answer. But notice where it all begins. The foundation for that answer is revering Christ as Lord in your hearts.
Now you might be thinking, that's all well and good, but what happens when I suffer because of my faith? Well, Peter addresses that head on. He says that if you suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed. And here's the crucial insight. When Christ is truly on the throne of your heart, the fear of what other people can do to you starts to lose its power. And that frees you to respond to hostility not with fear, but with a gentle and respectful explanation for the hope that you have. That is a complete game changer.
And it all comes back to this one beautiful central truth. The reason we can suffer well, the reason we can love our enemies, the reason we can bless those who insult us, it's all because of what Jesus has already done for us. This verse right here is the theological heart of the entire chapter. He, the righteous one, suffered for us, the unrighteous, for one purpose, to bring us back to God. This is the hope that changes everything.
So, let us move to our next section, core theological significance. Now we're going to take a closer look at the profound doctrines that Peter has embedded in this chapter. And we're going to see how every single one of them points back to the person and work of the Lord Jesus Christ.
You know, verse 18 is like a perfectly cut diamond of Christology. That's the doctrine of Christ, with many brilliant facets. First, it tells us his suffering for sin was a one-time, complete, and finished work. It was also vicarious, which means he stood in our place, the righteous for the unrighteous. And what was the purpose? It was reconciling. He did it all to restore our broken relationship and bring us home to God. That's the gospel in a nutshell. It's the bedrock of our entire faith.
Now, this next part of the chapter has been a source of much discussion, but it clearly traces Christ's path to ultimate victory. After his death and resurrection, Peter says Jesus made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits. Now, while good people can debate exactly who these spirits were, the main point is crystal clear. This was not a second chance for salvation. It was a declaration of total victory. Jesus was announcing his triumph over all the powers of darkness, right before ascending to the right hand of God, where he now reigns in absolute authority over everything.
So what does all of this have to do with us? Well, Peter connects it directly to our salvation, our soteriology, through the beautiful picture of baptism. He says that just as Noah and his family were brought safely through the floodwaters, baptism is a picture of our salvation. But he is incredibly careful to point out that it's not the physical water that saves us. Baptism is an outward sign of an inward reality. It is a public appeal to God, a declaration that we are trusting not in a ritual, but in the saving power of Jesus' resurrection.
Now we come to our fourth section, spiritual lessons for today. All right, we've looked at the history, we've unpacked the verses, we've examined the deep theology, but so what? How do we apply these timeless truths from 1 Peter 3 to our own lives, right here and right now?
What does this look like in our marriages? That means we start to see our marriage not just as a partnership, but as a mission. It means loving our spouse with a sacrificial love that puts their needs ahead of our own. It means intentionally creating a home where our family and our friends can see the love of Jesus in action. That is a high and a beautiful calling, and it's one that is only possible when Christ is truly the Lord of our hearts.
And how do we actually get ready to share our faith with others? Peter's command here can be broken down into some very practical steps. First, know your own story. Think through and even write out what God has done in your life. Second, know God's story. Find those key promises in the Bible that give you hope, especially when you're under pressure. Third, practice sharing your hope with gentleness and respect. And finally, live a life that backs up your words. The most powerful witness, after all, is a life of integrity.
And this leaves us with a really crucial question to reflect on, not just for ourselves, but for our churches. How can we intentionally create a community that is known for its grace, for its love? How can we become a people who bless others, even and especially when they don't deserve it? It's a big question, but it's an important one that each of us has a part in answering.
And now we come to our final section, the conclusion and blessing. As we wrap things up, let's bring our focus back to the main point, the anchor of this entire chapter. It's all about Jesus. He is the source of our hope, He is the source of our strength, and He is the one who makes this radical, countercultural life possible.
When Jesus is truly revered as Lord in our hearts, everything changes. Fear gives way to faith. The desire for revenge gives way to the power to bless. Our very lives become a quiet but compelling testimony to the grace of God. So, my prayer for you today is that you would experience the reality of Christ's Lordship in your own life, and that you would be a beacon of His hope in a world that so desperately needs it.
For more in-depth studies, visit the Grace and Knowledge Series blog at woodybrohm.online.